Hi, 7th graders. Hope all is well. This week we're going to be learning about a technique that scientists use in order to estimate the population size of different animals in the wild. In order to give you guys an idea of how this works, we're going to talk about the piping plover. The piping plover is a bird that is native to beaches in Queens and on Long Island. Before we get into the technique, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on the piping plover. As you can see, the piping plover lives in areas all over the United States, and then they travel north and south from winter to summer. And you can see here they're traveling from Florida to the Great Lakes and from islands in the Caribbean up to us in New York and on Long Island. They can travel a distance between 1,000 and 2,000 miles each autumn and again in the spring. And they can go right back to their favorite beach and know exactly where it is, even though they're traveling such long distances. Here we see a scientist using a mist net that they had set up along the beach in order to catch a piping plover. And then down here what you could see is that they're applying a tag to the piping plover's leg. Now this tag is very lightweight. The piping plover doesn't even know really that it's wearing it. And they're using a little tiny soldering iron in order to melt the metal so the tag does not fall off. And the bird is not harmed at all in this process of tagging. Next, what you can see they do is they wrap the bird in a cloth and weigh it on a scale. This is important data that the scientist tracks in case they catch this bird again or other birds of the same species, so they can have data on the bird's weight in different parts of the year. And then over here you can see that they have different color tags that they're going to be using to tag probably different species of birds. And here you can see they're using these tags in order to tag the piping plover. I think this is absolutely amazing. This piping plover here with the tag number 22, who they have named Harry Potter, has come back to the same beach on Long Beach, Long Island 3 years in a row. So imagine this bird is flying down to the Caribbean and back to Long Island every year, going to the same exact beach, and the scientists are able to track this bird because they've tagged it and they know this is the same bird that they caught 3 years in a row. So now you're probably wondering, how do scientists use these tags in order to estimate how many piping plovers there are out in the wild? And we're going to start answering that question by a little do now that I have here for you. Imagine you have a jar of marbles and you grab a handful of 10 marbles. So there's 10 marbles in this hand, and we know 2 of them are yellow. Now the only other thing we know is that there are 30 yellow marbles in this jar. How can we use that information to figure out how many marbles are in the jar in total? So again, we know there are 30 marbles in the jar, and we know we grabbed 10 marbles and 2 of them were yellow. So now think about how we could figure out how many marbles are in the jar in total. One technique that we can use is scaling. Since we know we have 2 yellow marbles in our hand and we have 10 marbles in our hand in total, we know that there are 5 times the amount of marbles in our hand compared to the yellow marbles. So if we assume that the number of yellow marbles in the jar are as evenly distributed as they are in our hand, then we can take the number of marbles, yellow marbles that we know are in the jar, and multiply that by 5 as well, which will give us a total of 150 marbles in the jar. I'm going to set up a ratio to show this idea again. So we know in our hand there are 2 yellow marbles, and we know there are 10 yellow marbles total in our hand. Now in the jar, we know there are 30 yellow marbles, but we don't know how many marbles there are in total. So there are 2 ways that we can work this ratio that you guys have seen in Miss McGaley's class. The first way is that we can say, well, in order to get from 2 to 30, I need to multiply by 15. So we could do the same thing for our denominator, and that'll give us a total of 150 marbles. We can also use a technique that you guys learned in core math, which is cross multiplication. So we can use this ratio, equivalent ratios, to set up an equation. And that equation is 2 times x, which is the total number of marbles in the jar, which we don't know, is equal to 10 times 30. So we get 2x equals 300. So 2 times some number is 300. So I know that that number must be 150. Throughout the rest of this lesson or activity, please feel free to use either method, or if you'd like to build a ratio table, you could do that as well. Now imagine we took a larger sample, so we're going to be looking here for our second question. So now we have 29 marbles in our sample, and we know 6 of those marbles out of the 29 are yellow. We still know there are 30 yellow marbles in the jar, but now we're going to use this larger sample to make another estimation about how many total marbles are in the jar. See if you could try that on your own. I'm going to use a multiplication in our ratio in order to figure out the total number of marbles in this jar. So I know that there were 6 marbles in our sample out of 29. Again, if we assume that the marbles in our sample are distributed the same way they are in the jar, then we can use the ratio of the number of marbles in our hand to figure out how many marbles are in the jar. So I notice there are 5 times as many yellow marbles in the jar, so that means there should be 5 times as many total marbles in the jar. This tells me that there are 145 marbles in the jar. So now we look at both of our solutions. Think to yourself, why might our estimations for the number of marbles in the jar be different when we use 2 different sample sizes? So here's the question for you to think about. Why, when we took 2 different samples, one was a sample of 10 total marbles and one was a sample of 29 total marbles, did we get different estimations for the number of total marbles in the jar? The second question I'd like you to think about is, which of these estimations do you think is more accurate? The first estimation, where we had a sample of 10 marbles and 2 of them were yellow, or the second estimation in which we had a sample of 29 marbles and 6 of them were yellow? I would also like you to explain why you think that sample gives us a better estimation of the total number of marbles in the jar. The app that we are going to use to simulate, capture, tag, and recapture, just like scientists do in the real world. The first thing that I'd like you to do is to drag the speed. It was here in the middle. I'd like you to drag the speed to about 1/4 of the way across this bar. That'll slow the fish down and make the app run better if you're using this on an iPad or an iPhone. The next thing I want you to do is check and make sure your pond size is set to medium, your population size is set to large, and your net size is set to medium. So let's go back and remember the first activity I asked you to do with the marbles. In that activity, we knew there were 30 yellow marbles in the jar, but we did not know how many marbles were in the jar in total. So what we did is we removed some marbles from the jar. We looked at how many of those marbles were in our hand, which in the first example was 10 marbles, and we saw that 2 of them were yellow. We used that ratio in order to estimate how many total number of marbles were in the jar, because we knew there were 30 yellow marbles in the jar. We're going to use that same technique here in order to try to figure out how many fish are in this pond. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that our net is on the medium net, and we're going to dip the net. Now right now our goal is to try to mark 25 fish. So we're going to mark all these fish and we're going to see the total number marked increase. We want to stop when that gets to 25. Okay, I got to 25. If I didn't get to 25, I would release these fish, I would catch some more fish, and I would mark a couple more until this number went to 25. But we do not want to go over 25 so that our data across the class, or all classes, is consistent. So I'm going to release these fish. So now, Just like with the marbles, we have no idea how many total fish are in this pond, but we do know that there are 25 marked fish in this pond. So we know there are 25 red ones, but we're not sure how many other fish are in the pond. And we're going to use the same technique we used with the marbles in order to try to figure out how many fish are in this pond. Okay, just like a scientist would, in order to figure out how many fish are in this pond, I have clicked dip net when the net size was medium, and you can see I have captured 25 fish in my bucket, and 2 of them are marked. And now I'm going to use this information to try to figure out how many fish are in my pond. Now, just to be clear, our first sample has to be any number of fish less than 30. You will see on the Google form that I've shared with you, there are different sample sizes that we need and different intervals of sample sizes, and I'll go over that later. But the first sample size is any number of fish in this bucket that is less than 30. And right now I have a total of 25 fish, and 2 of them are marked. I captured a screenshot from the last video. Here you can see we have our 25 total marked fish in this pond. And inside our sample bucket, we have 25 fish, 2 of which are marked. So in our ratio, we have 2 marked fish out of 25 total fish. And now this here, we're talking about our sample. And our population, we know there are 25 marked fish, but we are not sure how many total fish are in the population. So we can use one of the 2 techniques that I described in the Do Now in order to figure out how many fish are in this population. And you should try it now to practice. See if you can figure out, according to our sample, how many fish are estimated to be in this tank. So one technique we can use is cross multiplication. This gives us an equation of 2x equals 25 times 25. 2x equals 625. So 2 times something is 625. I'm going to divide by 2 in order to figure out what that something is. And allow me to grab a calculator, because even Mr. Rogers needs a calculator. 312.5. Now, as a mathematician, we know you can't have half a fish. So what we might do is say there's approximately 313 fish in the tank. When you click the link for the Google form, the questions are going to look like this. So here it's asking for the estimated population when the sample size is less than 30. So our sample size was 25, so it's going to go into this answer on the form, and then you're going to type in 313. So for our sample size of less than 30 fish, and we sampled 25 fish in our bucket, we estimate that there are 313 fish in the tank. However, this is not what you are entering in the sheet. You are going to do your own experiment. You might have exactly 25 fish in your first sample. You might have 27 fish or 22 fish. That's okay. You're going to use that number to estimate how many fish are in the population, and you're going to enter in your population estimate in that box. This 313 was the practice example, but I'd like you to enter your own information into that box. Let's release these fish and catch a sample size that's a little bit larger. So our second sample has to be between 40 and 60 fish. So I have the medium net here. I'm going to dip the net I got 20 fish. I'm going to dip the net again. And I got 50 fish. Okay, so I'm between 40 and 60 fish. And now we'll use the same techniques we've been using to try to estimate how many fish are in this pond. As a disclaimer, I just want to let you know I got lucky getting 25 and then 50 exactly. Your numbers will probably not work out like that. I'm sure it'll be a little bit different. So again, what we're going to do is set up a ratio. We have the number of fish that are marked as a ratio to the total number of fish. We are looking both at our sample and comparing it to our population. So in this sample, we see that there are 50 fish in the bucket and 7 of them are marked. In our population, we know that 25 of the fish are marked but we don't know how many fish are in the population. And maybe I should have made this red since the fish are red. But that's just a minor detail. So again, I'm going to use our cross multiplication. Actually, this time I'll use a different technique so we get used to using both. So I have 7 over 50 equals 25 over x. So I want to find a scale factor. So I need to figure out 7 times what gives me 25. So in order to do that, I'm going to do 25 divided by 7. And I'm going to grab a calculator. That's 3.57. I think 2 decimal places will be accurate enough for our work. Times 3.57. And I'm going to use that same scale factor to figure out how many fish are in the pond. And we get that x is equal to 178.5. And just like before, we know we can't have half a fish, so I'm going to round up to 179 fish. This is our estimated, keyword is estimated, population. And now we're going to go back to our Google Sheet and look at the second response. This is where we're entering the estimated population based on a sample size of between 40 and 60 fish in our sample bucket. So in this box, I would enter 179. Now again, you are not entering that number because your numbers will be different. So now I'm sure you're asking yourself, how is it possible then that using our first sample, our estimated population was 313 total fish. And using our second sample, our estimated population was 179 fish. So take a minute, think about why that may be the case, and continue doing the experiment. You are going to be required to do this 6 times. So here are our sample sizes. The first one is our sample size is going to be less than 30. For our second sample, our sample size will be between 40 and 60 fish. For our third sample, I want your sample size to be between 65 and 85 fish. For your fourth sample, I would like your sample size to be between 90 fish and 110 fish. For your fifth sample, I would like your sample size to be between 120 fish and 140 fish. And for your sixth sample, I would like your sample size to be more than 150 fish. So you will see a response for each of these sample sizes on the Google form. And on the Google form, you're inputting the estimated population. So you may actually want to write something like this down in a piece of paper or a notebook so that when you go out to fill out the form, it'll be a little bit easier. So for our first one, we got 313. For our second sample, which was between 40 and 60, we got 179. And then we would continue the experiment 4 more times, filling in this information. And this is the information we are going to be putting into our Google form. I will capture all of that information, and then we will review all of the data as a class. If you have any questions about this, you can ask me during our scheduled class time, or you can reach out to me on Slack, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. This is just the first part of this week's lesson. After we capture this information, I will be putting out the second part of this week's lesson to help you analyze this information and make a better guess about the number of fish inside of your tank, just as a scientist would do.